Welcome back to the channel. If you love immersive journeys into the past and stories that bring history to life, you're in the right place. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who enjoys history, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new story from the past. Tonight we drift back through time to the world of medieval Europe, a world of towering castles, muddy village paths, roaring feasts in royal halls, and endless days of labor in the fields. It was a time when society was sharply divided between those who ruled and those who worked the land. In this story we will explore one of the greatest contrasts of the medieval world, the life of the peasant and the life of the king. On one side stood the monarch, surrounded by wealth, power, and armies. On the other stood the peasant, rising before dawn to toil in the soil just to survive. Yet despite the enormous differences between them, their lives were deeply connected. Every royal feast, every army marching into battle, and every castle standing proudly above the countryside depended on the labor of ordinary people working the land. So sit back, relax, and let the sounds of history carry you into another time, as we explore what life was truly like in medieval Europe, from the muddy fields of the peasant to the stone halls of the king. Imagine waking up before sunrise in medieval Europe. The air is cold and damp, and the faint gray light of early morning barely filters through the small cracks in the wooden walls of your house. You lie on a rough bed stuffed with straw, covered with a thin blanket that offers little protection against the chill of the night. The room smells of smoke from last night's fire, mixed with the earthy scent of mud and animals. Your home is small, dark, and simple, built from wood, clay, and straw by the hands of the villagers themselves. The floor beneath you is not made of polished stone or wood, but hard-packed dirt that turns muddy when it rains. In one corner of the room sits a small hearth where a weak fire sometimes burns, filling the hut with smoke that slowly escapes through a hole in the roof. This is not just your bedroom. It is your entire house. Here, your whole family lives together in a single space, parents, children, and sometimes even animals during the cold winter months. Outside the hut, the village slowly begins to wake. A rooster crows somewhere in the distance. A dog barks. Wooden doors creak open as other villagers step outside to begin their long day of work. The fields stretch beyond the village like a sea of dark soil waiting for labor. These fields are not simply land. They are survival itself. Every grain of wheat, every bundle of barley, every vegetable grown here will determine whether your family eats or goes hungry in the coming winter. For most people living in medieval Europe, this was everyday life. They were peasants, farmers who made up nearly 90% of the population. Their lives were shaped by the land, by the seasons, and by the demands of those who ruled above them. The rhythm of their existence was dictated by sunrise and sunset. When the sun rose, the work began. When darkness returned, the work finally ended. Between those hours there was little rest, only labor that seemed endless. Now imagine a completely different morning in the very same world. The sun rises over a massive stone fortress standing high above the countryside. Thick walls stretch around it like the shell of a giant beast, towers rising into the sky. Guards stand watch on the battlements, scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. Heavy gates reinforced with iron protect the entrance, and inside the courtyard servants move quickly through their morning duties. In one of the highest chambers of the castle, a king awakens. His bed is large and comfortable, draped with fine fabrics and furs that keep the cold away. The walls of the room are covered with colorful tapestries that tell stories of battles, legends, and royal ancestors. Sunlight pours through tall windows, illuminating carved wooden furniture and polished stone floors. Servants quietly enter the chamber to prepare the king for the day. They bring water for washing, lay out fine clothing made of expensive fabrics, and prepare the morning meal. Unlike the peasant who must begin work immediately, the king's morning unfolds slowly and deliberately. Advisors will soon arrive with reports about the kingdom. Messengers will bring news from distant lands. Nobles may come seeking decisions, judgments, or favors. Every choice the king makes can shape the lives of thousands, sometimes millions, of people across the kingdom. The difference between these two mornings could hardly be greater, yet both exist within the same society. Medieval Europe was a world built on sharp divisions, a social structure where each person had a place, and moving beyond it was extremely difficult. At the very top stood the monarch, the king or queen who ruled the land. Beneath them were powerful nobles who controlled vast estates and commanded knights. The knights themselves served as warriors, protectors of their lords and fighters in the king's armies. Religious leaders, including bishops and abbots, held their own influence and power through the church. And at the very bottom stood the peasants, the farmers and laborers whose work sustained the entire system. To understand medieval Europe, one must understand this hierarchy. It was not simply a difference in wealth or comfort. It was a completely different experience of life itself. The peasants' world was small. Most peasants lived and died within a few miles of the place they were born. Their knowledge of the wider world came through traveling merchants, wandering priests, or stories passed down by word of mouth. Their days were filled with physical labor, plowing fields, planting seeds, harvesting crops, repairing tools, tending animals, and maintaining the small huts that sheltered their families. Their survival depended on the weather, the fertility of the soil, and the success of each year's harvest. A harsh winter or a season of poor rain could bring hunger to the entire village. Meanwhile, the king's world stretched across vast territories. Kings governed kingdoms that could include hundreds of towns, villages, and castles. Their concerns were not limited to crops and weather, but included war, alliances, diplomacy, and the constant challenge of maintaining authority over powerful nobles who sometimes had ambitions of their own. A king's court was filled with activity. Advisors debated policies, scribes recorded decisions, knights pledged loyalty, and nobles competed for influence. Yet despite the enormous gap between these lives, they were deeply connected. The king's wealth and power ultimately depended on the labor of peasants who worked the land. Every loaf of bread baked in a castle kitchen began as grain grown by farmers in distant fields. Every soldier marching under the king's banner relied on food produced by rural villages. The entire structure of medieval society rested on the productivity of those at the bottom. But for the peasants themselves, this connection often felt one-sided. They worked the land not only for their own survival but also to fulfill obligations to the local lord who controlled the estate. In many cases they were required to give a portion of their harvest, perform labor on the lord's fields, or pay taxes that helped support the noble household and the king above them. This system shaped nearly every aspect of medieval life. A peasant child born into a farming family could expect to follow the same path as their parents. Education was rare. Opportunities to travel or change professions were almost non-existent. Life was defined by tradition, by duty, and by the simple necessity of survival. Yet even within these limitations, village life contained its own forms of community and meaning. Neighbors helped one another during harvests, shared tools, and gathered during religious festivals or market days. The church often stood at the center of the village, not only as a place of worship but also as a gathering point where news was shared and important events were marked. Weddings, baptisms, and funerals brought the community together, reminding villagers that despite their hardships they were not alone. Meanwhile, the king's life was filled with ceremony and symbolism designed to reinforce authority and power. Royal clothing, elaborate crowns, and grand halls all served as reminders that the monarch stood above the rest of society. Public appearances, feasts, and royal proclamations helped project the image of a ruler chosen to guide and protect the kingdom. Yet even kings were not entirely free from uncertainty. Ruling a medieval kingdom involved constant negotiation with nobles who possessed their own armies and territories. Loyalty could shift quickly, alliances could change, and threats could appear both from within and beyond the kingdom's borders. While peasants feared hunger and harsh winters, kings feared rebellion, invasion, and political betrayal. The medieval world was therefore a place of contrasts. In one village, a farmer struggled to coax crops from stubborn soil, hoping the harvest would be enough to feed his family through the winter. In a distant castle, a king discussed matters of war, diplomacy, and law that could reshape entire regions. One life was defined by physical labor and local concerns. The other was defined by power and responsibility on a much larger scale. Yet both were part of the same complex system that held medieval Europe together for centuries. Understanding this contrast allows us to see the medieval world more clearly. It reminds us that history is not only the story of rulers and battles, but also the story of ordinary people whose work formed the foundation of entire civilizations. Behind every castle wall and royal decree stood countless farmers who planted seeds, harvested grain, and sustained the population of an entire continent. Their lives were difficult, often harsh, and sometimes tragically short, yet they carried the weight of society on their shoulders. And so the story of medieval Europe begins with two very different mornings. One in a smoky hut where a peasant prepares for another exhausting day in the fields. The other in a grand castle where a king rises to rule a kingdom. These two lives, separated by power, wealth, and privilege, existed side by side in the same world. Their differences reveal the deep inequalities of the medieval age, but their connection reveals something just as important: that the fate of kings and peasants was intertwined in ways that shaped the course of European history for centuries. In medieval Europe, the position of king represented the highest level of power and authority that a person could hold. To the people living in villages and towns across the countryside, the king often seemed like a distant but powerful figure whose decisions shaped the entire kingdom. His authority reached across forests, rivers, farms, cities, and castles, influencing the lives of thousands and sometimes millions of people. Being a king meant ruling over land, commanding armies, settling disputes among nobles, collecting taxes, and protecting the kingdom from enemies. The role carried enormous responsibility, but it also brought immense wealth, privilege, and influence. Many medieval people believed that kings ruled not simply because of political strength, but because they were chosen by God. This belief gave the monarch a sacred aura that elevated him above ordinary people. The idea that a king's authority came from divine approval became deeply rooted in medieval thinking and reinforced the loyalty expected from subjects throughout the realm. Throughout the Middle Ages, several rulers rose to power and left lasting marks on European history. One of the most influential early medieval rulers was Charlemagne, whose reign in the late 8th and early 9th centuries helped shape the political landscape of Western Europe. His rule demonstrated how powerful a medieval monarch could become when military strength, political skill, and religious support combined. Under rulers like him, the concept of kingship grew into something larger than simply controlling land. It became a symbol of unity, authority, and order in a fragmented world. Yet behind the grand image of kingship lay a daily life filled with challenges, responsibilities, and constant pressure to maintain power. A king's residence was usually a castle or royal palace designed to serve both as a home and as a defensive fortress. These structures dominated the landscape with thick stone walls, tall towers, narrow windows, and guarded gates. Castles were carefully positioned on hills, cliffs, or near rivers so that approaching enemies could be seen from far away. Deep moats, drawbridges, and fortified entrances added extra layers of protection. Within those walls, the royal household operated almost like a small city, with servants, guards, advisors, cooks, scribes, and nobles all moving through corridors and courtyards performing their roles in the complex life of the court. The king's private chambers were among the most comfortable spaces in the castle. Heavy curtains, colorful tapestries, and fine furniture decorated the rooms. Thick rugs and animal furs covered the floors to protect against the cold stone beneath. Unlike the smoky huts of peasants, royal chambers were designed to display wealth and authority. Large fireplaces warmed the rooms, and candles illuminated the halls during long winter nights. Tapestries often depicted scenes of legendary battles, hunting expeditions, or heroic ancestors, reinforcing the idea that the king belonged to a noble lineage stretching back through generations of rulers. Every morning the king's day began with a series of rituals and responsibilities. Servants attended to the monarch's needs, helping him dress in fine garments made from wool, silk, or velvet. These clothes were not chosen only for comfort but also for symbolism. The fabrics, colors, and decorations signaled the king's wealth and status to everyone who saw him. After dressing, the king might attend prayers or religious services within the castle chapel. Religion played a powerful role in medieval life, and rulers often emphasized their connection to the church to strengthen their authority. Once the formalities of the morning were complete, the real work of ruling began. Advisors and officials gathered in council chambers to discuss matters of the kingdom. Messengers arrived carrying news from distant regions, reporting on local disputes, economic conditions, or military threats. Nobles might appear before the king seeking judgments about land ownership, inheritance, or conflicts with neighboring lords. The monarch's decisions in these meetings could influence entire communities, determining who gained power and who lost it. Governing a medieval kingdom required constant attention because the political structure of the time was fragile and decentralized. While the king stood at the top of the hierarchy, many nobles controlled their own lands and maintained private armies of knights. These nobles were expected to remain loyal to the monarch, but loyalty was not always guaranteed. Rivalries, ambitions, and shifting alliances could easily turn a powerful noble into a potential threat. As a result, kings had to balance authority with diplomacy, rewarding loyal supporters while carefully managing those who might challenge their rule. Military leadership formed another essential part of kingship. Medieval Europe was a landscape frequently shaped by warfare. Border disputes, rival kingdoms, rebellions, and territorial ambitions often led to armed conflict. The king served as the supreme commander of the kingdom's forces, responsible for organizing campaigns and defending the realm. Knights and soldiers pledged their loyalty to the crown and expected the king to lead them wisely in battle. Preparation for war involved more than simply gathering troops. Weapons had to be produced, armor maintained, horses trained, and supplies organized. Castles and fortifications required maintenance to withstand potential sieges. Diplomacy also played a role, as alliances with neighboring rulers could determine the outcome of conflicts. Successful kings were often skilled strategists who understood both the battlefield and the complex web of political relationships surrounding them. Yet, despite the dangers and responsibilities of warfare, life within the royal court often displayed great wealth and ceremony. Feasts and banquets were common events designed to celebrate victories, honor visiting nobles, or mark important occasions such as marriages or religious festivals. Long wooden tables filled the great hall, covered with platters of roasted meats, freshly baked bread, cheeses, fruits, and wine. Musicians played instruments, storytellers entertained guests with tales of heroism and adventure, and performers displayed their talents before the assembled court. These gatherings served more than simply entertainment. They reinforced social bonds among nobles, displayed the king's generosity, and reminded everyone present of the wealth and prestige of the crown. Hospitality was an important part of medieval political culture, and a king who hosted impressive feasts could strengthen loyalty among powerful allies. Beyond the feasts and ceremonies, however, kings faced constant pressures. The stability of the kingdom depended on their ability to maintain control over distant territories where local lords held significant authority. Communication across large regions was slow, relying on messengers traveling by horse over rough roads. By the time news reached the royal court, a conflict or rebellion might already be underway. This meant that kings often relied heavily on trusted officials who governed provinces in their name. These officials collected taxes, enforced laws, and ensured that the king's authority remained visible even in distant corners of the realm. Taxation formed a crucial part of royal power. Maintaining armies, building castles, supporting the royal household, and funding government activities required significant resources. Taxes were collected in various forms, sometimes as money but often as goods such as grain, livestock, or labor. The wealth flowing into the royal treasury allowed the king to finance military campaigns, reward loyal nobles, and sustain the court's elaborate lifestyle. For the peasants who worked the land, these obligations could feel heavy, yet they were considered a normal part of the social order that defined medieval society. Religion also shaped the identity and responsibilities of kings. The church held enormous influence during the Middle Ages, and rulers often sought the support of religious leaders to legitimize their authority. Coronation ceremonies in which a king was formally crowned and blessed by clergy symbolized the connection between royal power and divine approval. The presence of religious figures during important political events reinforced the belief that the monarch ruled with the guidance and blessing of God. At times, this partnership between crown and church strengthened stability, but it could also lead to conflicts when religious leaders and kings disagreed over authority or policy. In addition to ruling their kingdoms, medieval kings often traveled extensively across their territories. Unlike modern governments with permanent capitals and administrative systems, many medieval courts moved from place to place. The king and his entourage might stay in different castles throughout the year, holding meetings, resolving disputes, and maintaining relationships with regional nobles. These journeys allowed the monarch to remain visible to subjects and demonstrate that royal authority extended across the entire kingdom. They also helped ensure that distant areas remained connected to the central power of the crown. Despite their immense power and wealth, kings lived with constant uncertainty. The medieval world was full of dangers that could threaten even the most powerful ruler. Rival claimants to the throne might attempt to overthrow the monarch. Ambitious nobles could rebel if they felt their interests were threatened. Foreign armies might invade seeking territory or influence. Even within the royal court itself, intrigue and betrayal sometimes unfolded as individuals competed for power and favor. Because of these risks, kings surrounded themselves with loyal guards and trusted advisors. Castles were designed not only to impress but also to protect against sudden attacks. Alliances through marriage were often used to strengthen political relationships between powerful families and neighboring kingdoms. Royal marriages were rarely about romance, they were strategic decisions, intended to secure peace, expand influence, or unite rival territories. Yet the burdens of kingship extended beyond politics and warfare. A king was expected to embody ideals of leadership, justice, and strength. Subjects looked to the monarch as the ultimate source of law and order. When disputes arose between nobles or communities, the king's judgment could determine the outcome. Fair rulings helped maintain stability, while poor decisions risked angering powerful groups. Balancing these expectations required wisdom, patience, and sometimes ruthless determination. Over time, the institution of kingship became deeply embedded in the culture of medieval Europe. Stories, songs, and legends celebrated heroic rulers who defended their lands and guided their people through difficult times. Castles, crowns, and royal symbols became powerful images representing authority and continuity across generations. Even when individual kings struggled or failed, the idea of monarchy itself remained central to the structure of society. Through all these complexities, the king stood at the center of a vast network of relationships linking nobles, knights, clergy, merchants, and peasants. His decisions influenced taxation, warfare, trade, and law throughout the kingdom. While the daily life of a peasant might revolve around plowing fields and tending crops, the king's life revolved around governing the entire realm. Yet despite the enormous difference in lifestyle, these worlds were connected. The wealth that supported castles, armies, and royal courts ultimately came from the labor of farmers working the land. The stability of the kingdom depended not only on the king's leadership but also on the productivity of the people who lived beneath his rule. Thus, the power and responsibility of a medieval king formed only one half of the story of life in that era, a story balanced by the struggles and contributions of the countless peasants whose work sustained the entire system. While kings ruled from castles and nobles lived in fortified estates, the overwhelming majority of people in medieval Europe lived very different lives. These people were peasants, the farmers and laborers whose daily work sustained the entire society. Their lives were deeply connected to the land they cultivated, the seasons that controlled the growth of crops, and the social system that determined their place in the world. For most peasants, life was shaped not by grand politics or royal decisions, but by the immediate concerns of survival, family, and labor. Every sunrise brought new work, and every sunset brought exhaustion after hours spent in the fields. To understand medieval Europe fully, one must step into the world of these ordinary villagers who formed the foundation of the entire social structure. A typical peasant village was small and closely connected to the surrounding farmland. The houses were scattered along narrow dirt paths, sometimes clustered around a church or a central open area where villagers gathered. Most homes were simple huts built from materials found nearby. Wooden beams formed the basic structure of the walls, while mud, clay, and straw were packed between them to create insulation. The roofs were usually made of thatched straw or reeds tied together and layered to keep rain from entering the house. While these structures offered basic shelter, they were far from comfortable. Wind could slip through small gaps in the walls, and heavy rain sometimes found its way inside despite the thatched roof. Inside a peasant home there was rarely more than one room. This single space served many purposes. It was where the family slept, cooked food, stored tools, and carried out daily household tasks. Furniture was limited to a few wooden benches, a rough table, and perhaps a small chest used to store clothing or important items. Beds were simple frames filled with straw or dried grass, often shared by several family members. During colder months, animals such as chickens or goats might be brought inside to keep them safe and to provide extra warmth. The presence of animals inside the home created strong smells and added to the crowded conditions, but it was considered normal and necessary for survival. The center of the home was the hearth, where a small fire burned when fuel was available. This fire provided warmth and was used for cooking meals. Smoke from the fire slowly filled the room before escaping through a hole in the roof or a small opening in the wall. Because chimneys were rare in peasant homes, the air inside could become thick with smoke, especially during winter when fires burned for longer periods. Over time, the interior walls and roof beams became darkened with soot. Daily life for peasants followed a strict rhythm determined by the rising and setting of the sun. Without artificial lighting or modern clocks, daylight was the most valuable resource for completing work. As soon as the first light appeared in the morning, families woke and began preparing for the day. After a quick and simple meal, often consisting of bread or leftover porridge, the villagers headed toward the fields that surrounded the village. Agriculture was the center of peasant life. The land provided nearly everything the villagers needed to survive, from grain used to bake bread to vegetables that supplemented their diet. Farming in medieval times was labor-intensive, and depended on simple tools and human strength. Wooden plows drawn by oxen were used to break the soil and prepare it for planting. Farmers carried sickles and scythes to cut grain during harvest season. Hoes, rakes, and wooden forks helped manage weeds and gather crops. These tools were not highly advanced, and much of the work depended on patience, skill, and long hours of physical effort. Peasant farmers grew a variety of crops depending on the region and climate. Wheat was one of the most important grains because it could be ground into flour and baked into bread, which formed the staple food of many communities. Barley and oats were also common, used for porridge and animal feed. In addition to grains, peasants planted vegetables such as cabbage, onions, beans, and turnips. Small garden plots near their homes often provided herbs and other plants used for cooking or simple medicines. Farming followed the cycle of the seasons. Spring was the time for plowing and planting. Farmers prepared the soil, sowed seeds, and hoped for good weather that would allow crops to grow. Summer brought long days of tending fields, removing weeds, and caring for animals. Autumn was the most critical season because it was harvest time. Families worked together from dawn until dusk, cutting grain and gathering vegetables before the cold weather arrived. The harvest determined whether the village would have enough food to last through the winter months. Winter itself was a quieter but still challenging season. Fields lay frozen, but other work continued, including repairing tools, caring for animals, and maintaining homes. Peasant life was not only shaped by farming but also by the social structure that controlled land ownership and labor. Most villages existed within the system known as feudalism. Under this system, land was controlled by a lord who held authority over the estate. The peasants living on that land were allowed to farm certain fields for their own survival, but in exchange they owed labor, crops, or taxes to the lord. Many peasants were serfs, a group that occupied a position between free citizens and slaves. Serfs were legally tied to the land they worked. They could not simply leave the village and move elsewhere without permission from the lord. If the land changed ownership, the serfs living on it were transferred along with the property. This restriction limited freedom but also provided a certain level of stability because the lord was expected to protect the villagers from outside threats and ensure that they had access to farmland. A portion of the fields surrounding the village belonged directly to the lord's estate. Peasants were required to spend several days each week working on these fields instead of their own. The crops produced from the lord's land supported the noble household and contributed to the wealth of the estate. In addition to labor, peasants might also provide part of their own harvest as rent or tax. These obligations could sometimes feel heavy, especially during years when crops were poor. Despite these demands, village life was built around cooperation and shared effort. Farming tasks often required many hands working together. During planting and harvest seasons, entire families and groups of neighbors helped one another in the fields. This sense of cooperation helped villages survive difficult times. If one family experienced hardship, others might share food or assistance when possible. Food itself reflected the modest conditions of peasant life. Bread made from coarse grains formed the main part of most meals. This bread was darker and heavier than the fine white bread eaten by nobles because it contained more bran and was made from mixed grains. Peasants also prepared thick porridge from oats or barley, which was filling and easy to cook over a small fire. Vegetables such as cabbage, onions, and beans added flavor and nutrients to their diet. Meat was not a regular part of everyday meals for most peasants. Raising animals required resources, and many animals were more valuable alive than as food. Chickens provided eggs, cows produced milk, and oxen were needed to pull plows. When meat was eaten, it usually came from pigs, which could be raised with fewer resources and slaughtered during special occasions or seasonal festivals. The church played a central role in the lives of peasants. Almost every village had a church building where religious services were held. For villagers, the church was more than a place of worship, it was also the center of community life. Important events such as baptisms, weddings, and funerals were conducted there. Religious festivals provided moments of celebration and relief from the constant labor of farming. These occasions allowed villagers to gather, share food, and strengthen social bonds. Education was limited in most peasant communities. Few villagers could read or write, and knowledge was passed down through oral tradition and practical experience. Children learned by observing their parents and gradually taking on responsibilities as they grew older. Boys might begin helping with plowing or tending animals, while girls assisted with cooking, spinning wool, and maintaining the household. Childhood in medieval villages was often short. From a young age, children were expected to contribute to the survival of the family. They fetched water from wells, gathered firewood, watched over younger siblings, and helped in the fields during busy seasons. Although life involved hard work, children still found moments for play and storytelling within the village community. Health and medicine presented constant challenges for peasants. Without modern knowledge of hygiene or disease prevention, illnesses could spread easily through villages. Simple injuries from farming tools could become dangerous if infected. Most medical treatments relied on herbal remedies prepared from plants found in the surrounding countryside. Local healers or wise women sometimes provided advice and treatments, but their knowledge was limited compared to modern medicine. Clean water was not always available, and waste disposal systems were very basic. As a result, diseases could spread quickly, especially during periods of overcrowding or poor sanitation. For many peasants, life expectancy was shorter than in modern times, and families often faced the loss of loved ones due to illness or accidents. Despite these hardships, peasants developed strong community ties and traditions that helped them endure difficult conditions. Seasonal festivals, religious celebrations, and village gatherings offered opportunities to rest from work and enjoy moments of joy. Music, dancing, storytelling, and shared meals allowed villagers to connect with one another and maintain a sense of cultural identity. Even within the strict structure of medieval society, peasants were not completely powerless. Their labor was essential to the survival of the entire kingdom. The crops they produced fed nobles, soldiers, and city populations. Their work supported trade, markets, and the growth of towns. Without their efforts, the social and economic system of medieval Europe could not have functioned. Yet for most peasants, the reality of life remained tied to the soil beneath their feet. Their world was defined by fields, seasons, family responsibilities, and the obligations owed to the lord of the land. While kings discussed politics and nobles planned battles, peasants continued their daily struggle to produce food and maintain their homes. Through their labor, they sustained a society that often overlooked their contributions. Their lives were rarely recorded in grand chronicles or royal histories, yet they formed the backbone of medieval civilization. The villages they built, the crops they harvested, and the communities they nurtured created the foundation upon which castles, cities, and kingdoms were able to rise. In medieval Europe, the contrast between the lives of peasants and the lives of kings could be seen clearly in the most basic parts of daily survival. Food, health, and the constant struggle to stay alive in a world where disease, hunger, and harsh living conditions were common. While the royal courts enjoyed abundance and luxury, most ordinary people lived with uncertainty about whether they would have enough to eat or whether illness might suddenly strike their families. Food was not just a matter of comfort or taste in the medieval world. It was the foundation of survival, the difference between strength and weakness, between life and death during difficult years. For peasants, the entire cycle of life revolved around producing and preserving enough food to endure the winter months when fields lay frozen and supplies slowly dwindled. The diet of a peasant family was simple and repetitive. Bread formed the center of most meals, and it was eaten almost every day. Unlike the soft white bread enjoyed by nobles and kings, peasant bread was dark, heavy, and coarse. It was made from grains such as barley, rye, or oats, often mixed together depending on what was available. The flour used for this bread was not finely refined, which meant that small pieces of husk and bran remained in the dough. When baked in simple ovens or over hearth fires, the result was a dense loaf that filled the stomach but was far from delicate in texture or flavor. Bread was sometimes used as a kind of edible plate called a trencher, placed under other foods to absorb liquids and sauces. After the meal, the soaked bread might be eaten or shared with animals. Alongside bread, peasants commonly ate porridge made from grains boiled in water or milk. This thick mixture was easy to prepare and provided a filling meal that could be shared by the entire household. Vegetables grown in small gardens near the home added variety to the diet. Cabbage, onions, peas, beans, and turnips were among the most common crops. These vegetables could survive in different climates and were relatively easy to grow with the tools available to medieval farmers. They were often cooked together in stews or soups that simmered slowly over the hearth fire, allowing flavors to blend and ingredients to soften. Protein in the peasant diet usually came from eggs, dairy products, or legumes rather than meat. Chickens provided eggs that could be eaten fresh or used in cooking. Cows and goats supplied milk, which could be turned into butter or cheese. Cheese was particularly valuable because it could be stored for long periods without spoiling, making it a reliable source of nutrition during colder months. Peas and beans also provided important nutrients and could be dried and stored for later use. Meat was far less common in the daily life of peasants than it was in noble households. Raising animals for slaughter required resources that many families could not spare. Livestock such as cows and oxen were often more valuable alive because they produced milk or helped with plowing fields. Pigs were sometimes raised because they could feed on scraps and forage in forests, making them easier to maintain. When a pig was slaughtered, its meat was carefully preserved through salting, smoking, or drying so that it could last for weeks or months. Even then, meat was usually eaten in small portions and reserved for special occasions or celebrations. Food preservation was essential for survival. Medieval villages lacked refrigeration or modern storage methods, so families relied on traditional techniques to keep food from spoiling. Salting was one of the most common methods. Meat or fish could be packed in salt to draw out moisture and prevent bacteria from growing. Smoking was another technique, where food was hung above a fire so that smoke slowly dried and flavored it. Drying fruits, grains, and vegetables in the sun allowed them to be stored for longer periods. Pickling in vinegar or brine also helped preserve certain foods. Despite these methods, food shortages were a constant threat. A single failed harvest caused by drought, excessive rain, or crop disease could leave an entire village struggling to survive. In years of poor harvests, people might eat whatever they could find, including wild plants, roots, or even tree bark. Historical records describe times when hunger forced communities to ration food carefully, stretching small supplies through long winters. Malnutrition weakened the body and made people more vulnerable to illness. In contrast to the modest meals of peasants, royal courts experienced food in a completely different way. Kings and nobles enjoyed an abundance of ingredients and a much wider variety of dishes. Large kitchens staffed by skilled cooks prepared meals that displayed the wealth and status of the ruling class. Roasted meats such as beef, venison, and wild boar were common at noble banquets. Fish was also widely consumed, especially on religious days when the church restricted the eating of certain meats. Spices imported from distant lands added flavor and prestige to noble dishes. These spices, including pepper, cinnamon, and cloves, were expensive and therefore served as symbols of wealth. Meals in a royal court often took place in grand halls filled with long tables and decorated with banners and tapestries. Servants moved between guests carrying platters of food, pouring wine, and ensuring that the feast continued smoothly. Entertainment frequently accompanied these meals. Musicians played instruments, performers told stories or recited poetry, and guests celebrated victories, alliances, or religious festivals. Such feasts were not merely about satisfying hunger. They were important social events that strengthened relationships among nobles and displayed the generosity and power of the king. While the royal court enjoyed rich food and comfortable surroundings, peasants faced daily challenges related to health and sanitation. Most villages lacked organized systems for waste disposal or clean water. Wells provided drinking water, but they could easily become contaminated. Waste from animals and households often accumulated near living areas, creating conditions where disease could spread. Personal hygiene practices were limited by the availability of water and soap. Bathing occurred far less frequently than in modern societies. Medical knowledge in medieval Europe was also limited. Many illnesses were poorly understood, and treatments often relied on tradition rather than scientific evidence. Herbal remedies were commonly used because certain plants were known to relieve pain or treat minor infections. Local healers or wise women gathered herbs from fields and forests to create mixtures that might be applied as poultices or brewed into teas. While some of these remedies had genuine benefits, many illnesses remained beyond the ability of medieval medicine to cure. Injuries from farm work presented another risk. Sharp tools such as sickles and axes could easily cause cuts, and heavy labor sometimes led to broken bones or strained muscles. Without modern medical care, even small wounds could become infected and dangerous. Recovery from serious injuries was uncertain, and many people lived with the long-term effects of accidents. Disease was perhaps the greatest threat to survival in medieval Europe. Epidemics could sweep through villages and towns with devastating speed. One of the most infamous outbreaks in history was the Black Death, which spread across Europe during the 14th century. This deadly disease, caused by bacteria carried by fleas on rats, killed millions of people within a few short years. Entire communities were wiped out as the illness spread from one region to another. Symptoms included fever, swelling, weakness, and severe pain, and most victims died within days of becoming ill. For peasants living in crowded villages with limited sanitation, the plague proved especially deadly. Families watched helplessly as neighbors and relatives fell sick. Fear and confusion spread alongside the disease as people struggled to understand why such suffering had descended upon their communities. Many believed the plague was a punishment from God, while others blamed contaminated air or mysterious forces beyond human control. Even outside of major epidemics, disease remained a constant presence in medieval life. Illnesses such as dysentery, influenza, and various infections regularly affected villages. Without vaccines, antibiotics, or advanced medical knowledge, people relied on prayer, herbal remedies, and hope for recovery. The contrast between the health conditions of peasants and those of nobles was noticeable but not absolute. Kings and nobles had access to physicians who studied ancient medical texts and offered treatments based on the knowledge available at the time. These doctors sometimes recommended bloodletting, special diets, or herbal medicines. While such treatments were not always effective by modern standards, they at least provided the wealthy with some form of medical attention. However, even royal households were not immune to disease. Plagues and infections could reach castles just as easily as villages. History records many kings, queens, and nobles who died from illnesses that today might be treatable. In the medieval world, wealth could provide comfort and care, but it could not guarantee protection from every danger. Nutrition also influenced health outcomes. The richer diets of nobles sometimes included more meat and variety, which could provide better nutrition in some cases. Yet the heavy consumption of rich foods and alcohol could also lead to health problems of its own. Peasants, while limited in diet, often consumed simpler foods that were naturally balanced in grains and vegetables. Nevertheless, the overall hardships of their lives meant that their health was constantly challenged by physical labor and limited resources. Seasonal changes also played an important role in health and survival. Winters were especially difficult because food supplies ran low and cold temperatures increased the risk of illness. Poor heating in peasant homes meant that families relied heavily on shared body warmth and small fires to stay comfortable. Respiratory illnesses often spread during these months as people spent more time indoors in smoky, poorly ventilated spaces. Despite these challenges, communities developed ways to cope with the difficulties of medieval life. Villagers supported one another during illness and shared resources when possible. Religious faith provided comfort and a sense of meaning during times of hardship. Festivals and seasonal celebrations offered moments of joy and relief from the constant pressure of survival. Through all of these experiences, food, health, and survival remained central concerns for ordinary people living in medieval Europe. The contrast between the abundance of royal feasts and the modest meals of peasant families reflected the broader inequalities of the time. Yet both kings and peasants lived within the same fragile world where disease, hunger, and uncertainty were never far away. Their lives, though vastly different in comfort and privilege, were connected by the same natural forces and the same struggle to endure in a challenging and unpredictable era. Between the powerful monarch who ruled the kingdom and the peasants who worked the land stood another important group in medieval society: the nobles and the knights. These individuals formed the middle layers of the medieval hierarchy, acting as the bridge between royal authority and the everyday life of the countryside. Their role was essential in maintaining order, defending territories, and managing the vast lands that made up medieval kingdoms. Without them, kings would have struggled to control distant regions, and a system that defined medieval life would not have functioned as it did for centuries. Understanding the lives and responsibilities of nobles and knights helps reveal how the entire structure of medieval society operated and why the relationships between these groups were so important. The social system that connected kings, nobles, knights, and peasants was known as feudalism. This system was based on a network of loyalty, land ownership, and mutual obligation. At the top of the hierarchy stood the king, who technically owned all the land within the kingdom. However, the king could not manage such vast territory alone. Instead, he granted large portions of land to powerful nobles in exchange for their loyalty and military support. These nobles, sometimes called lords, controlled large estates that included villages, farmland, forests, and rivers. In return for receiving this land, they pledged to support the king during times of war and to maintain order within their territories. The noble class consisted of powerful families who held authority over significant regions of land. Their homes were often castles or fortified manors that served both as residences and defensive strongholds. Like the king's castle, these structures were designed to protect against enemies and to symbolize power. Thick walls, towers, and guarded gates gave nobles the ability to defend their land if necessary. Inside the castle, life could be comfortable compared to the modest conditions of peasant homes. Noble households included servants, cooks, guards, and administrators, who helped manage the daily operations of the estate. Nobles were responsible for overseeing the land under their control. This meant ensuring that fields were farmed, taxes were collected, and justice was maintained among the people living on their estates. When disputes arose between villagers or tenants, the local lord often acted as the judge who decided the outcome. This responsibility gave nobles significant influence over the lives of the peasants who depended on their land for survival. In many ways, the nobles served as the local authority figure, representing the king's power within a specific region. The relationship between nobles and the king was based on loyalty and service. Nobles swore oaths promising to support the monarch and provide soldiers during times of war. In return, the king recognized their authority over the lands they governed and protected their rights as members of the ruling class. This relationship created a chain of obligations that extended throughout the entire kingdom. Each level depended on the one above and below it, forming a complex web of loyalty that held medieval society together. Below the nobles in this structure were the knights, the warriors who played a central role in the military life of the Middle Ages. Knights were trained soldiers who fought on horseback and wore heavy armor designed to protect them in battle. Their weapons included swords, lances, shields, and sometimes maces or axes. The equipment of a knight was expensive and maintaining it required significant resources. As a result, knights were usually supported by land grants or by serving under a powerful lord who provided them with the means to fulfill their duties. Becoming a knight was not an easy process. It required years of training and preparation that often began in childhood. Boys born into noble or knightly families might start their training around the age of 7. At this stage they were known as pages and lived in the household of a noble family where they learned basic skills such as riding horses, handling weapons, and practicing good manners. They also learned the customs of noble society, including respect for authority and loyalty to their lord. As they grew older, these young trainees became squires, serving directly under experienced knights. During this stage they learned how to care for armor and weapons, assist knights in preparing for battle, and participate in training exercises. Squires accompanied knights to tournaments and sometimes even to real battles, gaining practical experience in the life of a warrior. After several years of training and proving their skill and courage, a squire might finally be granted the title of knight during a formal ceremony. Knighthood carried both privileges and responsibilities. Knights were expected to serve their lord faithfully, especially during times of war. When the king or a noble called for military support, knights gathered with their weapons, armor, and horses to join the army. They fought in battles, defended castles, and protected territories from invading forces. Their skill in combat made them one of the most important elements of medieval warfare. The image of the knight also became associated with ideals of honor and chivalry. The code of chivalry encouraged knights to demonstrate courage, loyalty, generosity, and respect toward others, particularly women and the weak. While the reality of medieval warfare was often harsh and violent, these ideals influenced the cultural image of the knight as a noble warrior who upheld justice and protected society. Knights did not spend all their time fighting. In periods of peace they managed their lands, trained for combat, and participated in tournaments. Tournaments were large public events where knights competed in contests of skill such as jousting. During a joust, 2 mounted knights charged toward one another with lances, attempting to knock the opponent from his horse. These competitions were both dangerous and exciting, drawing crowds of spectators who gathered to watch the spectacle. Tournaments allowed knights to demonstrate their abilities, gain prestige, and sometimes win prizes or recognition. While nobles and knights enjoyed privileges and status far above those of peasants, they were still dependent on the agricultural work performed by villagers. The wealth that supported castles, armor, and military campaigns came largely from the crops produced on the land. Peasants farmed fields, raised livestock, and produced goods that generated income for the estate. In return, they received protection and access to land where they could grow food for their families. This relationship between the different levels of society formed the foundation of medieval stability. The king relied on nobles for military support and governance. Nobles relied on knights to defend their lands and maintain order. Knights relied on the resources provided by estates and the labor of peasants. Peasants relied on the protection offered by their lords and the structure of the system that allowed them to farm the land. Each level had its own responsibilities, and the entire structure functioned only because these relationships remained intact. However, the system was not always peaceful or stable. Conflicts sometimes arose between nobles who competed for land or influence. Rivalries could lead to private wars between powerful families, creating instability in certain regions. Kings had to manage these rivalries carefully to prevent them from threatening the unity of the kingdom. At times the monarch might intervene directly, negotiating peace or using royal authority to settle disputes. The power held by nobles could sometimes challenge the authority of the king himself. Because nobles controlled large territories and commanded their own knights, they possessed significant military strength. If several powerful nobles united against the king, they could create serious political challenges. For this reason, medieval rulers spent considerable effort maintaining alliances with the noble class through rewards, marriages, and political agreements. Castles played a central role in the lives of nobles and knights. These fortresses served as both homes and military centers where troops could gather and supplies could be stored. In times of danger, villagers might seek refuge inside the castle walls for protection. The presence of a castle also symbolized the authority of the lord who controlled the surrounding land. Life inside a noble household involved many activities beyond military preparation. Administrative tasks were necessary to manage large estates effectively. Officials kept records of harvests, taxes, and legal decisions. Servants maintained the household, prepared meals, and cared for guests who visited the castle. Nobles often hosted gatherings, feasts, and celebrations that strengthened relationships with neighboring lords and members of the royal court. Marriage also played an important role in noble society. Noble families arranged marriages not only for personal relationships, but also to strengthen political alliances and expand influence. By marrying into another powerful family, a noble could gain access to additional lands or secure valuable partnerships. These alliances helped shape the political landscape of medieval Europe, linking families and territories across wide regions. Religion remained an important influence on nobles and knights as well. Many nobles supported the construction of churches or monasteries on their lands. They donated resources to religious institutions and sought the blessing of the church to legitimize their authority. Knights sometimes participated in religious military campaigns known as crusades, traveling long distances to fight in wars that were framed as defending or expanding the Christian faith. Through all these responsibilities and relationships, the nobles and knights served as the connective tissue of medieval society. They ensured that the king's authority reached distant villages and that the resources produced by the land were organized and protected. Their presence maintained the structure that allowed medieval kingdoms to function despite the limited communication and transportation systems of the time. At the same time, their position illustrated the deep hierarchy that defined the era. While peasants struggled with daily labor and kings commanded entire nations, nobles and knights occupied a middle ground where privilege was balanced by duty. They enjoyed wealth, status, and influence, yet they were also expected to defend the realm and maintain loyalty to the crown. In this way, the medieval system resembled a long chain in which each link supported the others. If one link weakened or broke, the stability of the entire structure could be threatened. The relationships between kings, nobles, knights, and peasants therefore formed the foundation of political and social life throughout much of medieval Europe. For many centuries, the structure of medieval society appeared stable and unchanging. Kings ruled from their castles, nobles governed their lands, knights defended their lords, and peasants worked the fields that fed the entire population. This system, built on the relationships between land, loyalty, and labor, shaped daily life across much of Europe. Yet beneath this appearance of stability, powerful forces were slowly beginning to reshape the medieval world. Economic changes, population shifts, natural disasters, and growing tensions between social classes all contributed to a transformation that would eventually weaken the traditional system that had defined life for generations. One of the most dramatic events that disrupted medieval society was the spread of the devastating plague known as the Black Death. When this deadly disease arrived in Europe during the 14th century, it changed the course of history in ways few people at the time could have imagined. The plague spread rapidly from region to region, carried by fleas that lived on rats traveling along trade routes and aboard merchant ships. As infected fleas bit humans, the disease passed into the bloodstream, causing severe illness that often led to death within days. The impact of the plague was catastrophic. Entire towns and villages lost large portions of their population in a short period of time. Families were torn apart as parents, children, and neighbors fell sick. In some places, so many people died that fields were left uncultivated and houses stood empty. The fear surrounding the disease was immense because no one understood exactly how it spread or how it could be stopped. Many people believed the plague was a punishment from God, while others blamed contaminated air or mysterious natural forces. The massive loss of life created unexpected consequences for the structure of medieval society. Before the plague, peasants were abundant, and labor was easy for landowners to obtain. After the plague reduced the population, the situation changed dramatically. With fewer people available to work the land, surviving peasants suddenly found their labor in much higher demand. Fields still needed to be planted and harvested, but there were not enough workers to do the job. This shift gave peasants new leverage that had rarely existed before. Landowners who once had complete control over labor now faced shortages of workers. To keep farms productive, some lords began offering better conditions, higher wages, or reduced obligations in order to attract peasants to their estates. In certain areas, peasants even gained the ability to move to different lands in search of better opportunities, something that had previously been restricted under the traditional system. These changes gradually weakened the rigid structure that had bound peasants to the land for generations. Although feudal obligations did not disappear overnight, the balance of power began to shift in subtle but significant ways. Peasants who realized the value of their labor started to question why they should continue to accept the same heavy burdens they had carried before the plague. At the same time, governments and nobles attempted to resist these changes. Many rulers feared that rising wages and increased freedom for peasants would undermine the social order that supported their power. Laws were introduced in several regions to control wages and prevent peasants from leaving their villages. These laws attempted to force workers to accept the same pay and conditions that existed before the population decline. However, enforcing such laws proved difficult. The reality of labor shortages meant that many landowners quietly ignored restrictions in order to keep their fields productive. Over time, the economic pressure created by the reduced population continued to push society toward change despite attempts to preserve the old system. As tensions between peasants and the ruling classes increased, conflicts began to erupt in different parts of Europe. One of the most famous examples occurred in England during the 14th century in an uprising known as the Peasants' Revolt. This rebellion was sparked by several factors, including heavy taxes imposed by the government and growing frustration among peasants who believed they were being treated unfairly. Thousands of ordinary people, including farmers, laborers, and craftsmen, joined together to protest against the system that limited their freedom and demanded high taxes. They marched toward the capital city, calling for reforms that would reduce the power of the ruling elite and grant greater rights to common people. Although the revolt was eventually suppressed by the authorities, it demonstrated that peasants were becoming more willing to challenge the traditional social hierarchy. Similar unrest appeared in other parts of Europe as well. Peasant uprisings occurred in regions such as France and the German states, each reflecting the growing dissatisfaction among rural populations. While many of these revolts were defeated by the forces of kings and nobles, they revealed that the old assumptions about unquestioned obedience were beginning to weaken. Economic changes also contributed to the gradual transformation of medieval society. Trade and commerce expanded during the later Middle Ages, connecting distant regions through networks of merchants and markets. Towns and cities began to grow as centers of trade, craftsmanship, and economic activity. People who moved to these urban areas often found opportunities that were very different from the rigid structure of rural villages. In cities, craftsmen organized themselves into guilds that regulated trades such as blacksmithing, weaving, carpentry, and baking. These guilds provided training, maintained quality standards, and protected the interests of their members. Young workers could begin as apprentices, learning a craft from an experienced master, eventually becoming skilled artisans themselves. This system created a path to economic independence that was not available to most peasants living under feudal obligations. The growth of towns also weakened the traditional power of local lords. As merchants and craftsmen gained wealth through trade, they formed a new social group that did not fit neatly into the older feudal hierarchy. Some cities even negotiated special rights or charters that allowed them to govern themselves with a degree of independence from nearby nobles. Over time, these economic developments began to reshape the relationship between land, labor, and power. Wealth was no longer tied exclusively to owning farmland. Trade, craftsmanship, and urban enterprise created alternative sources of income and influence. This shift gradually reduced the dominance of the feudal system that had once controlled nearly every aspect of life. Kings also played a role in these changes. Some monarchs recognized that growing cities and commercial activity could strengthen royal authority by reducing the power of rival nobles. By granting charters to towns and supporting trade, kings could increase tax revenues and build stronger centralized governments. This process helped lay the foundations for more unified states in later centuries. Technological improvements contributed to the transformation as well. Advances in farming tools, watermills, and windmills increased agricultural productivity in certain regions. Better shipbuilding techniques expanded trade across seas and rivers. Improvements in navigation allowed merchants to travel farther and connect markets that had previously been isolated from one another. Although these developments unfolded gradually, their combined effects slowly altered the structure of medieval society. The rigid boundaries that once separated peasants, nobles, and kings became less absolute as economic opportunities and social mobility increased. The idea that a person's place in life was permanently fixed began to weaken. Despite these changes, the medieval world did not disappear immediately. For many people, daily life remained centered on farming, local traditions, and obligations to landowners. Castles still dominated the countryside, and kings continued to rule their kingdoms with the support of nobles and knights. Yet beneath this familiar landscape, the foundations of society were shifting in ways that would eventually lead to a new era. The late medieval period, therefore, represents a time of transition. It was an age when old traditions coexisted with emerging possibilities, when ancient hierarchies faced new pressures from economic growth and social change. The experiences of peasants, nobles, and kings during this time reflected a world slowly moving away from the rigid structure that had defined earlier centuries. In the end, the story of medieval Europe is not only about the contrast between kings and peasants, but also about the gradual transformation of the system that connected them. The forces that began reshaping society during the later Middle Ages would continue to evolve in the centuries that followed, leading to the rise of stronger nation-states, expanding trade networks, and new ideas about power and freedom. What began as a world divided sharply between castle and village gradually became more complex and dynamic. The peasants who once seemed locked into a life of endless labor began to discover new possibilities, while the kings who once ruled through traditional hierarchies had to adapt to a changing landscape of power. Through these slow but powerful changes, the medieval world moved step by step toward a new chapter in European history.